In the spring of 1241, beneath storm-dark skies in Silesia, the greatest cavalry force the world had ever seen met Europe's last desperate army in a battle that would decide whether Christian civilization would survive or vanish beneath Mongol hooves. The scouts arrived at dawn, half dead from exhaustion, their horses foam-flecked and trembling. They brought news that turned blood to ice water in the veins of every prince, bishop, and knight gathered in the stone halls of Wrocław. The Mongols were coming, not as a distant rumor whispered along trade routes, not as an abstract terror from chronicles of distant lands. They were 3 days' ride away, moving faster than any army in memory, burning everything in their path. It was April 1241, and Eastern Europe was dying. For 2 years, the Mongol storm had swept westward like the wrath of an angry god. They had shattered the armies of Russ, ground Kiev into dust, and crossed the Carpathian Mountains in winter, a feat military minds considered impossible. Hungary was already bleeding under their hooves. Poland had become a highway of ash and abandoned villages. And now they were moving toward Silesia, toward the wealthy German principalities, toward the very heart of Latin Christendom. Duke Henry II of Silesia, called Henry the Pious, stood at the center of a nightmare. He was 37 years old, devout, cautious, a man who had spent his life managing the delicate politics of a border province. He had prepared for wars with other Christian princes, for disputes over succession and territory. He had not prepared for this. The Mongols brought something Europe had never faced, a military system perfected over generations of conquest, combining speed, discipline, and tactical sophistication that made European feudal armies look like armed mobs. They moved in coordinated columns, communicated with signal arrows and flags, feigned retreats that lured enemies into killing zones, and wielded composite bows that could pierce mail at 200 paces. They had conquered more territory in 20 years than Rome had in 2 centuries. And now, in the green fields of Silesia, they were about to collide with everything Christian Europe could muster for a last, desperate stand. Henry gathered his forces, knights from Poland, Silesia, and Moravia, Teutonic knights in their white surcoats with black crosses, Templar knights in red and white, men from the mining towns and trading cities, French volunteers who had come east seeking glory, a patchwork army united only by terror and faith. Perhaps 20,000 men, maybe 25,000. The chronicles disagree, but all agree on one thing. It wasn't enough. The Mongol force approaching under the command of Kaidu and Baidar, grandsons of Genghis Khan himself, numbered somewhere between 20 and 30,000. But numbers meant less than quality. These were men born in the saddle, who could fire arrows while galloping at full speed, who had perfected the art of war as a science, while Europe still thought of battle as a test of individual courage. On April 9th, 1241, the 2 armies would meet near the village of Legnica, in flat fields broken by scattered woods and gentle streams. What happened there would echo across Europe for generations. It would be remembered as the day Christendom held the line, even as it broke. The day Europe discovered it was no longer the center of the world, no longer militarily supreme, no longer safe behind the walls of faith and feudal tradition. This is the story of that battle, of courage that could not overcome reality, of an army that fought to the last breath against an enemy they could not understand, of the moment when the East and West collided and the future of a continent hung on the edge of a Mongol sword. The storm was coming, and there was nowhere left to run. To understand the terror that gripped Europe in 1241, you must understand what the Mongols had become. 40 years earlier, they had been scattered tribes fighting over scraps of grassland. Then came Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, and everything changed. He unified the tribes through a combination of genius, brutality, and vision. He created a military machine unlike anything the world had seen. And then he pointed it outward. By 1241, the Mongol Empire stretched from Korea to the gates of Vienna. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. And it had achieved this through systematic, calculated conquest that combined psychological warfare with military excellence. The Mongols did not fight like Europeans. They did not believe in honorable single combat, or in the idea that cavalry should charge headlong into enemy lines. They fought with discipline, deception, and devastating firepower. Their composite bows, made of horn, wood, and sinew, could pierce armor at ranges European archers couldn't match. They used mobility as a weapon, circling and harassing until the enemy broke formation or exhausted themselves, then striking with coordinated precision. They also used terror as policy. Cities that resisted were annihilated so completely that grass grew over the ruins. Cities that surrendered were sometimes spared, but their populations often scattered or enslaved. The message was clear: resist and die, or submit and survive. It worked. Fear traveled faster than the Mongol armies themselves. In 1237, they turned their attention to Europe. The invasion began with Russ, the collection of principalities centered around Kiev that would one day become Russia and Ukraine. The Rus princes, proud and fractious, could not unite against the threat. The Mongols destroyed them one by one. Kiev, the Golden City, the mother of Russian civilization, fell in December 1240 after a siege that left it a smoking wasteland. From there, the Mongol army split into multiple columns, a characteristic of their operational art. One force moved south into Hungary, another drove west through Poland toward Silesia and the German principalities beyond. The commander of the northern thrust was Kaidu, grandson of Genghis Khan, and an experienced general who had fought in campaigns from China to the Caspian Sea. With him rode Baidar, another of Genghis's grandsons, and a cadre of officers who had learned war from the greatest conquering dynasty in history. They moved with terrifying speed. European armies crawled at perhaps 10 miles a day, dragged down by supply wagons and armored knights on heavy horses. The Mongols averaged 25 or 30 miles, sometimes more. Each warrior led several horses, switching between them to maintain pace. They carried dried meat and mare's milk, living off the land and their own efficiency. They were not an army in the European sense. They were a migration of predators. By the spring of 1241, they had carved a path of destruction through Poland. Sandomierz burned, Krakow burned, Chmielnik burned. In each case, the pattern was the same: rapid approach, brief siege, or direct assault, annihilation or scattering of defenders, then on to the next target. The Mongols did not occupy. They destroyed, plundered, and moved forward. News of each disaster reached the western principalities like hammer blows. Refugees flooded into Silesia and Bohemia, bringing tales of horror. Entire cities reduced to ash, populations massacred or dragged away in chains. An enemy that moved like the wind and struck like lightning. Warriors who could shoot arrows with impossible accuracy from galloping horses. Tactics that made no sense to European military minds. Europe's response was chaos. There was no unified defense because there was no unified Europe. The Holy Roman Empire was a patchwork of princes and bishops who spent more time fighting each other than cooperating. Poland was divided among several dukes. Hungary's king, Bela IV, sent desperate messages begging for help, but help was slow to come or didn't come at all. The Pope himself, Gregory IX, called for a crusade against the Mongols. But crusades took time to organize, and time was the one thing Europe didn't have. The Mongols were not waiting for Christian Europe to mobilize. They were already at the gates. Duke Henry II of Silesia understood that if the Mongols were not stopped, they would continue west into Bohemia, Bavaria, and eventually the Rhine. Everything would fall. Every city, every kingdom, every church. The entire edifice of Christian civilization would collapse like a house built on sand. He called for a coalition, and men answered. Henry the Pious was not a warrior king in the romantic sense. He was known for his piety, hence the epithet, and for his patronage of the church. He had founded monasteries, supported the Cistercians, and governed his duchy with a careful eye toward maintaining peace with his neighbors. But in the spring of 1241, peace was a luxury no one could afford. Word of the Mongol advance spread through the German principalities like wildfire. Henry sent urgent appeals to every Christian power within reach, to his relatives in other Polish duchies, to the King of Bohemia, Wenceslaus III, who commanded a large and experienced army, to the Teutonic Knights, the militarized religious order that had carved out territories in Prussia and the Baltic, to anyone who would listen. The response was mixed. King Wenceslaus agreed to come, but his army was assembling slowly. He promised to march north from Bohemia with perhaps 50,000 men, an enormous force that could tip the balance. But mobilizing feudal armies took time. Knights had to be summoned from their estates. Supplies had to be gathered. Agreements had to be negotiated. It would take days, perhaps weeks. Henry decided he could not wait. The Mongols were moving too fast. If he delayed until Wenceslaus arrived, the enemy might bypass him entirely and ravage Bohemia from behind, or double back and trap both armies separately. Every day of waiting meant another town burned, another 1,000 people killed or enslaved. He chose to intercept them. His army assembled at Legnica, a fortified town in the flat plains of Silesia. It was a coalition force drawn from across the region. The Polish knights, the core of Henry's strength, heavy cavalry in mail and plate, armed with lances and swords, trained in the European tradition of shock charges. These men were the military elite of their society, raised from childhood to fight on horseback, bound by codes of honor and chivalry. They were brave, devout, and accustomed to fighting other Christians in limited, ritualized warfare. They had never faced an enemy like the Mongols. The Teutonic Knights, an elite force of warrior monks, some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. Disciplined, fanatical, utterly committed. They wore white surcoats emblazoned with black crosses and fought with the grim efficiency of men who believed death in battle was a pathway to heaven. These were men who had fought pagans in the Baltic, who had carved out territories through systematic conquest and conversion. They knew how to fight and how to die. The Templars, another military order present in smaller numbers but equally renowned. The red cross on white was one of the most feared symbols in Christendom. But their experience was in the Holy Land, fighting Saracens in desert warfare. This was different. The plains of Silesia were not the deserts of Outremer, and the Mongols were not the Saracens. Miners and townsmen, infantrymen recruited from the gold and silver mining towns of Silesia. These were not peasant levies dragged unwillingly from their fields. They were skilled workers, many of them German settlers, who had some experience with weapons and discipline. They carried spears, axes, and crossbows. They knew how to work together, how to follow orders. They were not knights, but they were not rabble either. Moravian and Lesser Polish nobles. Additional contingents from neighboring territories, some led by Henry's relatives and allies. Men like Boleslaus of Moravia, who brought his own retinue of knights and soldiers. Men who had their own lands, their own ambitions, but who understood that if Silesia fell, they would be next. Altogether, perhaps 20 to 25,000 men. It was the largest army Henry could muster. It represented the military power of an entire region, and it was still smaller, less experienced, and less coordinated than the force moving toward them. The Mongols approached from the east. Scouts reported multiple columns converging, moving with unnerving precision. They had already demonstrated their tactical acumen by feinting toward Wrocław, then swinging north when Henry moved to block them. They were not a mindless horde. They were executing a campaign plan developed over decades of conquest. On April 8th, the two forces drew close. Henry chose his ground carefully. The battlefield near Legnica was mostly flat farmland, broken by a few streams and patches of woodland. It was not ideal for defense. There were no significant hills or rivers to anchor a position, but it was open enough for cavalry, and Henry's army relied on heavy cavalry charges. The ground was firm enough for armored horses. The fields were wide enough for formations to deploy. He arrayed his forces in the traditional European fashion. Knights in the center and on the wings, infantry in support, banners raised high. The crosses of the Teutonic and Templar orders flew alongside the banners of Polish and Silesian nobility. The dragon standard of Poland snapped in the wind. It looked impressive. Thousands of armored men on horseback, steel glinting in the spring sun, the accumulated military might of Christian Europe. Henry placed the Teutonic Knights on the right wing, where their discipline would be most valuable. The Templars anchored the left. His own Polish knights held the center, where he would ride at their head. The infantry formed blocks behind the cavalry, ready to support or to serve as a rallying point if the charge faltered. Priests moved among the men, blessing weapons, hearing confessions, offering prayers for victory. The mood was tense, but not without hope. These men had faith. They had armor. They had the tradition of knighthood, the weight of 1,000 years of European military culture. They believed that courage and righteousness would prevail. As the sun set on April 8th and the campfires dotted the fields, every man in that army knew the truth beneath the hope. They were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and facing an enemy whose reputation for invincibility was spreading faster than the Mongol columns themselves. Henry spent the night in prayer. He was a devout man, and he believed, he had to believe, that God would not abandon Christendom in its hour of need. He prayed for strength, for wisdom, for victory. He prayed for his wife and children, for his duchy, for the people he was sworn to protect. Across the field, in the Mongol camp, there was no anxiety, only preparation. The Mongol commanders, Kaidu and Baidar, held council with their officers. They had fought across continents. They had destroyed armies larger than this one, in terrain more difficult than these flat Silesian plains. They knew exactly what they would do. The Mongols fought in a system of decimal organization, units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Each knew its role. Each knew the signals. They would use mobility and archery to break the European formation, then feigned retreats to draw the knights out of position, and finally coordinated strikes to encircle and annihilate. They had done it 100 times before. Against the Jin dynasty in China, against the Khwarezmian Empire in Central Asia, against the armies of Russ, against the Hungarians at the Sarjo River. The tactics worked. The system worked. All that remained was execution. As night fell on April 8, 1241, the two armies slept, or tried to. Some prayed, some sharpened weapons, some stared into the darkness and wondered if they would see another dawn. Tomorrow, the storm would break. April 9, 1241 began with fog. A heavy mist rolled across the fields, shrouding the Silesian plain in grey. Visibility was poor. The air was cold and damp. From the European camp, you could barely see 100 paces. From the Mongol camp, the same. For Henry and his commanders, the fog was an omen. It meant they could not see the enemy's movements. It meant the Mongols could maneuver unseen, could position their deadly horse archers, could set up ambushes or flanking movements without detection. For the Mongols, the fog was irrelevant. They had scouts everywhere. They had perfected communication through signal flags, arrows, and horns. Fog did not confuse them. It confused their enemies. That was enough. The armies formed up in the grey dawn. Henry's coalition assembled in traditional battle order, a centre mass of heavy cavalry, flanked by wings of knights and supported by infantry blocks. Banners hung limp in the still damp air. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath visible in the cold. Men adjusted their armour, tightened straps, muttered prayers. The Mongols formed into their characteristic dispersed line. Multiple units spread across a wide front, maintaining distance between formations to allow for rapid manoeuvring. They rode light horses, smaller than the European destriers, but faster and more enduring. Each warrior carried a composite bow and a quiver of arrows, along with a saber, a lance, and sometimes a lasso for dragging enemies from their saddles. The Mongol front line was deceptively thin. It looked like it could be broken easily. That was intentional. Behind the front line, hidden by the fog and the terrain, were reserve units ready to exploit any opening, to strike any weakness, to turn any European success into a trap. No one knows who attacked first. Some chronicles say the Europeans advanced, unwilling to wait in the fog for an enemy who might be maneuvering around them. Others say the Mongols began the engagement with a sudden barrage of arrows from the mist, designed to provoke a reaction. What is certain is that by mid-morning, the two armies were locked in battle. And from the first moments, it went wrong for the Christians. The Mongol archers opened fire at ranges the Europeans couldn't match. Composite bows, perfected over centuries on the steppes, could send arrows flying 200 paces or more, with enough force to pierce mail. The Mongols rode in crescent formations, circling at the edge of effective range, loosing volley after volley into the packed European lines. The sound was like rain on a roof, but harder, sharper. Thousands of arrows falling from the sky. The Polish knights, armoured but not invulnerable, began to take casualties. Arrows found gaps in armour, the joints, the neck, the face where visors were raised. They struck horses in the chest, the legs, the vulnerable flanks. Men fell. Horses screamed and reared, throwing riders. The neat formations began to fray. European crossbowmen tried to return fire, but their weapons were slower to reload and shorter in range. They managed to bring down some Mongol riders, but for every one they hit, a dozen arrows came back in return. The infantry, standing in tight blocks behind the cavalry, raised shields and tried to weather the storm, but shields could only cover so much. Men began to fall there too. Henry's commanders did what European military tradition dictated. They ordered a charge. It was the core tactic of medieval warfare. Heavy cavalry, riding knee to knee, lances levelled, crashing into the enemy line with the weight and momentum of flesh, steel, and faith. It had won battles for 1,000 years, against other knights, against infantry, against lighter cavalry. The charge was devastating. A wall of armored horsemen moving at full gallop was an unstoppable force. The Mongols had been expecting it. Henry gave the signal. Trumpets sounded. Banners dipped forward. The Polish knights in the center spurred their horses into motion. The Teutonic knights on the right wing advanced in perfect formation, a white wall with black crosses. The Templars on the left moved forward with the disciplined fury of warrior monks. Thousands of hooves began to churn the ground. The charge started slowly, a trot, then a canter. The horses needed distance to build momentum. The riders leaned forward, lances couched under their arms, shields raised. The ground shook as the European knights thundered forward, lances down, hooves pounding. The Mongol units in front of them turned and fled. It looked like panic. It looked like the enemy was breaking before the charge even made contact. It was neither. The Mongols had perfected the feigned retreat to an art form. Units would turn and gallop away, drawing the enemy forward in pursuit, stringing them out, breaking their cohesion. Then, at a signal, they would wheel and counterattack, or fresh units would strike from the flanks, or the retreating force would suddenly stop, turn, and unleash a devastating volley at close range into disordered, exhausted pursuers. The European knights charged after the fleeing Mongols, believing they had achieved a breakthrough. The Teutonic knights, their white surcoats splattered with mud, pressed forward with disciplined fury. Polish nobles and their retinues galloped alongside them. From the European perspective, the enemy was routing. Victory was within reach. Henry himself rode in the center, surrounded by his personal guard. He could see the Mongols fleeing. He could hear the thunder of his own cavalry. He believed, for a moment, that they might actually win. Then the fog thickened. Accounts from survivors mention a strange, acrid smoke that suddenly rolled across the battlefield, denser than the morning mist. Some chronicles describe it as unnatural, a dark sorcery summoned by Mongol shamans. The reality was likely more prosaic, but no less effective. The Mongols may have used smoke pots or burning materials to create artificial cover. They had used such tactics before in sieges and field battles. Whatever the source, the effect was devastating. The charging Europeans plunged into a grey wall. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Units lost contact with each other. The neat formations of the charge dissolved into confused groups, knights shouting to find their comrades, horses colliding in the murk. The sound changed. The thunder of hooves became muffled, confused. Men called out orders that no one could hear. Trumpets blared, but the signals meant nothing when no one could see who was where. And then the Mongols struck. From multiple directions at once, Mongol cavalry units wheeled and attacked. They didn't charge head-on. They circled. They harassed. They used their superior mobility to hit the flanks and rear of the confused European force, and all the while, they kept firing. Arrows fell like hail. The Mongols could fire while riding at full gallop, a skill European knights couldn't match and could barely comprehend. They rode close, loosed arrows, then wheeled away before the Europeans could close with them. It was death from 100 directions, and there was no defense. The Polish knights, heavily armored but exhausted from the pursuit, found themselves surrounded. They tried to form defensive positions, but there was no center, no clear leader, no way to coordinate in the smoke and chaos. Individual groups fought with desperate courage, but courage alone couldn't overcome tactical annihilation. Knights who managed to catch up with the Mongols found themselves facing enemies who simply melted away, only to have more Mongols strike from behind. It was like fighting ghosts. The Europeans were trained for frontal combat, for the clash of lance against shield, for the test of strength and skill in close quarters, but the Mongols refused to fight that way. They refused to stand still. They refused to die according to European rules. Some Polish nobles, seeing their men being cut down by arrows, tried to retreat back to the main line. But in the fog, they couldn't find it. They wandered in circles, harassed by Mongol riders, losing men with every passing minute. Others tried to force their way through the circling enemy, but the Mongols simply opened gaps to let them through, then closed in behind them. The Teutonic Knights fought like men possessed. They formed a tight formation, a wedge of white and black, and they pushed forward with terrible determination. They were disciplined enough to maintain cohesion even in the chaos. They killed Mongols who came too close, their heavy swords cleaving through lighter armor, their lances punching through shields and riders alike. For a moment, it seemed like the Teutonic wedge might break through. They cut down the Mongols in front of them. They pressed forward, step by bloody step. Their Grand Master, whose name is lost to history, rode at their head, his sword rising and falling, his voice roaring encouragement. But the Mongols didn't need to stop them, they just needed to contain them. Units of Mongol horse archers circled the Teutonic formation, staying just out of sword range, pouring arrows into the tightly packed knights. The Teutons' white surcoats turned red. Their horses stumbled and fell. Men in the rear ranks began to drop. Still, they pushed forward, refusing to break, refusing to flee. Then, the Mongol reserves hit them. Fresh units of heavy cavalry, yes, the Mongols had heavy cavalry too, armored lancers for decisive moments, charged into the flanks of the Teutonic wedge. The impact was shattering. The formation buckled. Knights were knocked from their saddles. The wedge became a knot, then a desperate circle of surrounded men fighting back to back. They fought for another hour, maybe longer. Time becomes meaningless in that kind of chaos. They fought until their arms were too tired to lift swords. They fought until their horses were dead beneath them. They fought until there was no one left to fight. The Grand Master fell, pierced by a dozen arrows and finally cut down by a Mongol saber. The survivors, and there were not many, tried to surrender. The Mongols killed them anyway. Henry's position in the center had become untenable. The fog and smoke were lifting slightly now, and what he could see was a nightmare. His right wing, the Teutonic Knights, was destroyed. His left wing, the Templars, was surrounded and being systematically annihilated. The center, his own Polish knights, was scattered and disorganized. Mongol riders were everywhere. They moved in coordinated groups, executing a plan that Henry couldn't understand because he had never seen anything like it. This was not a battle in the European sense. This was an execution. Henry tried to rally his men. He rode forward, with his banner raised high, calling for the knights to form on him. Some came, maybe a few hundred. They formed a rough circle around their duke, shields out, ready to sell their lives dearly. The Mongols closed in, but they didn't rush. They didn't charge in for the kill. They circled just out of reach, and they kept firing, arrow after arrow. The circle grew smaller, men fell, horses died. The banner wavered. Henry's standard-bearer, a young knight whose name we will never know, was hit in the throat. He fell, and the banner went down with him. Another man grabbed it and raised it again. He lasted perhaps 30 seconds before an arrow took him in the eye. Henry himself fought with the fury of desperation. He was not a great warrior, but he was brave. He swung his sword at Mongol riders who came too close. He killed at least one, maybe more. But it didn't matter. There were always more. The circle shrank. 100 men, then 50, then 20. Henry knew it was over. He could see it in the faces of his men. He could see it in the way the Mongols moved, patient and efficient, like hunters cornering wounded prey. Some accounts say he tried to surrender, others say he fought to the end. The truth is probably somewhere in between. He was a duke, not a fool. He knew his life had value, that he could be ransomed. But the Mongols were not interested in ransoms. They were interested in terror. The final moments are unclear. In the chaos and the smoke, with men dying all around him, Henry II of Silesia fell. He may have been struck from his horse by an arrow. He may have been dragged down by Mongol lassos. He may have been overwhelmed in a final rush. The chronicles differ. What they agree on is that he died, and that his death broke the last will of the Christian army. With Henry dead and his banner fallen, the army disintegrated. Men who had held their ground now ran. Units that had fought with discipline now scattered like birds before a hawk. The retreat became a rout. The rout became a massacre. The Mongols pursued with methodical efficiency. This was the part of the battle they had been preparing for. The killing was not done in rage or passion. It was done as policy, as a lesson to anyone who might think about resisting. They hunted the fleeing Europeans through the fields and woods. Some knights tried to make it back to Legnica, hoping the walls might save them. Most didn't make it. The Mongols were faster, and they knew how to cut off retreating forces. Small groups of Europeans tried to stand and fight, to buy time for their comrades to escape. The Mongols killed them and kept moving. There was no mercy. There was no quarter. There was only the systematic destruction of an army. The infantry, who had been held in reserve, never had a chance to engage. They saw the cavalry destroyed. They saw the Mongols coming. Many threw down their weapons and fled. Others tried to form defensive squares, pikes out, shields locked. The Mongols circled them, shot them full of arrows, then rode them down when the formations finally broke. By late afternoon, the battlefield was a charnel house. Bodies lay scattered across miles of farmland. Horses wandered riderless, wounded and confused. The streams ran red. The ground was churned to mud and blood. The Mongols regrouped, efficient even in victory. They gathered their own dead, far fewer than the Christians, but not insignificant. They collected arrows, salvaged weapons, tended to wounded horses. They moved like a machine, even after hours of combat. And then they began the final terrible ritual that would seal Legnica's place in European memory. The Mongols collected the heads of the fallen nobles. They piled them in a pyramid on the battlefield. 9 sacks full, according to some chronicles. Hundreds of heads. The cream of Polish and Silesian nobility. The knights who had defended Christendom, reduced to trophies. Henry's head was among them. They identified it by the gap between his teeth, a distinctive feature mentioned in multiple accounts. They took it and paraded it on a lance through the nearby villages, a message to anyone who might think about resisting. His body, stripped of armor and dignity, was left on the field with thousands of others. The survivors, and there were not many, fled west with news of the disaster. They spoke of an enemy that couldn't be beaten, of tactics that made no sense, of a slaughter so complete that entire noble families had been erased in a single day. Perhaps 9 out of every 10 men in Henry's army died at Legnica. The Teutonic Knights were nearly wiped out, only a handful escaped. The Templars suffered catastrophic losses. The Polish nobility was decimated. Entire lineages ended that day in the mud of Silesia. The Mongols had won a complete and total victory. And yet, the invasion ended. The Mongol army did not continue west. After the battle, Kaidu and Baidar regrouped and assessed their situation. They had destroyed one European army, but they knew another was coming. King Wenceslaus of Bohemia was marching north with 50,000 men. He had been days away from Legnica, and when news of the battle reached him, he halted. He did not retreat, but he did not advance recklessly either. He consolidated his forces, chose defensive ground, and prepared for a siege if necessary. The Mongols, despite their victory, faced a strategic problem. They were deep in hostile territory. Their supply lines stretched back across Poland into the steppes. They had taken casualties, not crippling, but enough to make them wary of another major battle immediately. And they had learned that a massive Bohemian army was positioned to block further westward advance. More critically, news arrived from the south. The main Mongol army in Hungary, under Batu Khan, had won a devastating victory at the Battle of Mohi just 2 days after Legnica. But the conquest of Hungary was taking longer than planned. Batu needed all available forces to consolidate the gains and deal with Hungarian resistance. And then came the word that changed everything. Ögedei Khan, the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of the entire Mongol Empire, son of Genghis Khan, had died. He had died months earlier, back in the Mongol heartland. But the news took time to travel. When it reached the Western armies, it triggered a succession crisis. By Mongol law and tradition, all the princes and commanders had to return to Karakorum, the capital, to participate in the selection of the next great Khan. The invasion of Europe ended not because Europe defeated the Mongols, but because the Mongols chose to leave. Kaidu and Baidar withdrew their forces eastward. They moved back through Poland, then into Hungary to link up with Batu. From there, the entire Mongol army in Europe retreated across the Carpathians and the steppes, heading home. They never came back. Western Europe breathed again. The cities that had prepared for siege relaxed. The princes who had gathered armies disbanded them. Slowly, over the spring and summer of 1241, the realization spread. The storm had passed, but the cost had been staggering. Henry the Pious was buried with full honors in the Cathedral of Wrocław. His body, what was recovered of it, was interred as a martyr and a defender of Christendom. The church honored him. The people mourned him. His widow, Anna, ruled as regent for their young son. She would spend the rest of her life trying to rebuild what the Mongols had destroyed. Silesia and Poland bore scars that would take generations to heal. Entire regions had been depopulated. Thousands of prisoners had been dragged east into slavery, never to be seen again. Villages and towns lay in ruins. The economic and demographic damage was catastrophic. Poland's fragmentation, already a problem, deepened. The various duchies, weakened and traumatized, would struggle for stability for decades. The Battle of Legnica entered European consciousness as a symbol of courage in the face of impossible odds. It was remembered as the day Christian knights stood against the Mongol horde, and though they fell, they bought time for the rest of Europe to prepare. In reality, they had bought nothing. The Mongols withdrew for their own reasons, not because of Legnica. But the myth was powerful. It gave meaning to the sacrifice. It turned a military disaster into a moral victory, and it served as a warning. Europe had discovered, in the most brutal way possible, that it was not invincible, that its military traditions were not supreme, that there were powers in the world against which feudal courage and heavy cavalry were not enough. The Mongols had shown what professionalized, mobile, coordinated warfare could achieve. They had demonstrated the superiority of combined arms, strategic mobility, and tactical discipline over the ritualized combat of European knighthood. Some European powers learned the lesson. Over the following centuries, warfare would gradually evolve. The dominance of heavy cavalry would decline. Infantry with pikes and crossbows would rise. Discipline and coordination would begin to matter more than individual prowess. Eventually, gunpowder would render the armored knight obsolete. But in 1241, those changes were far in the future. For the survivors of Legnica, there was only grief, trauma, and the knowledge that they had stood at the edge of an abyss and stared into it. The Mongol Empire would remain the largest land empire in history. It would stretch across Asia and into Eastern Europe, a power so vast that it reshaped trade, politics, and culture across 3 continents. The Pax Mongolica would eventually facilitate exchanges between East and West, spreading ideas, technologies, and diseases. But it would never again reach the gates of Western Europe. The death of Ögedei Khan and the internal politics that followed redirected Mongol ambitions elsewhere. The window had closed. The tide had reached its high water mark and receded. Legnica remained a scar and a story. The field where thousands died. The day the East came to the West and found it unprepared. The battle where courage and faith met cold tactical superiority and lost. Centuries later, the battlefield near Legnica is quiet farmland. There is a monument, a simple stone cross marking the place where Henry fell. Tourists visit occasionally. Historians debate the details, but the essential truth remains. On April 9, 1241, Europe faced an existential threat and barely survived. Not through victory, but through fortune. The Mongols withdrew not because they were defeated, but because they chose to leave. And in the smoke and blood of that spring day in Silesia, the medieval world glimpsed its own obsolescence. The age of the armored knight, of feudal honor, of Christendom's assumed supremacy, it was ending. The Mongols had proven it. The lesson was written in the bodies of thousands, in the ashes of cities, in the terror that gripped a continent. Europe would never forget, and it would never be quite the same.